Good evening, everyone. Erev Tov. Shh. Welcome on behalf of my colleagues, Rabbi Roli Matalan, Rabbi Becca Weintraub, our Rabbi Shuli Passo is in the back, and Cantor Dave Mintz, and our whole team here. We want to welcome you to BJ, whether you're joining us in person or on the live stream, which hundreds and hundreds of people are. We are really grateful that you are here to take part in what we believe is a deeply important and timely conversation. American Jews have long spoken of a big tent, a communal space broad enough to hold deep disagreement while sustaining a shared sense of peoplehood. Today, that tent is being tested as never before. A generational shift that has been unfolding for years has come sharply into focus since October 7th, challenging long-held assumptions about Israel and Jewish identity. Conversations about Israel, Zionism, Jewish safety, Palestinian rights, and the meaning of democracy have grown more urgent and more polarized. Closer to home, the election of our own mayor has created profound divisions and painful animosity within our own community. The question before us is no longer what true commitment to Israel and the Jewish people looks like, but whether a tent large enough to include its supporters, its skeptics, and its fiercest critics can still endure. We are honored to welcome this illustrious panel, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, Peter Beinart, and Esther Sperber, with Rabbi Irwin Kula serving as moderator. I think you can look on the website for their bios. We don't want to spend the time giving their bios. Together, they represent distinct and divergent perspectives on Zionism, Jewish democracy, and the future of Israel-diaspora relations. Also about the mayor, too. This panel will explore the fault lines reshaping Jewish identity and the practical challenges facing our community and institutions. How big can the Jewish tent be? And what must it hold if it is to survive? We want to be clear that the views expressed this evening are those of the individual panelists and do not represent the official positions of BJ, Roli, or myself, Becca, Shuli, Dave. What BJ does believe in is the power of dialogue and the Jewish tradition of machloket l'shem shamayim, of disagreement for the sake of heaven. Our panelists who hold profound disagreements with one another believe in this too, which is why they're here. They are here to model a possibility that is too often missing from our public discourse, particularly in the Jewish community, particularly now. We know that many in our sanctuary and online bring strong feelings to this conversation. This is welcomed. Our hope for tonight is that we each hold our own feelings and convictions while also opening ourselves to listening with humility and curiosity to other perspectives. This is spiritual work, hard spiritual work, but it is the work that this moment calls for, and we must rise to that challenge. We ask that this space be marked by civility and derech eretz. This is not a pep rally for any one perspective. Please refrain from clapping or booing or hissing. This is a sanctuary. I want to say it again. I know it sounds funny, but we've had many events here where that's not the case. And so that is upon all of us to create the sacred space that allows us to listen with generosity, even if we disagree. We are a deeply polarized community, another source of deep pain for so many of us. Tonight, let us make room to listen, to honor the fear, the trauma, the discomfort, and the challenge of this moment, no matter where we stand politically. Coincidentally, the date when all our panelists could gather is today, January 6th. This is a date that tragically will forever stand as a warning of how fragile democracy can be, and how easily rhetoric, fear, and absolutism can erode shared norms. Let us pray that tonight's conversation affirms a different path, one rooted in humility, responsibility, and the hard, sacred work of sustaining both democracy and community, even in times of deep disagreement. Finally, we invite you to pose questions for the Q&A portion of the evening by writing your questions on the note cards that were, I think, on your seats or handed out as you came in. We will begin to collect these note cards at around 7:50, and we encourage you to write your questions down once we are into the conversation so that they are informed by what you have heard from the panel. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Irwin Kula.
Okay, good evening, everybody. There's plenty of energy in the room, and if my email box and my social media and my voicemail is any indication, and the numbers that are streaming and the numbers that are here, I guess there's some anticipation about this evening. So I think we have a choice about what the energy in the room is. The energy, I mean, there's a lot of nervous energy. I'm going to frame this conversation in a second. There's a lot of nervous energy, and I think we have a choice whether the energy, is channeled in sort of toxic ways, which is a specialty right now in Jewish life and in America, or it can be channeled in holy ways, and the energy can be holy. And that's really our choice, and it's every individual's choice. So I don't know, boo, hiss, whatever, but that's a real choice about what to do with what it is we're feeling. There's a joke that I heard a long time ago that when Adam and Eve were leaving the Garden of Eden, Adam turned to Eve and said, "Honey, we're living in a moment of transition." So I have a feeling that we have a sense that we're living in one of those moments, and here's how I want to frame tonight. You're probably not here unless you have a serious sense that the American Jewish body politic, American Jewish community is pretty fractured. There has been what some people call a collapse of the mainstream consensus. Some people call it a collapse of the Zionist consensus that has shaped American Jewish life for the last 60 years. And it's a collapse that was in the making, but it surely was accelerated by October 7th and the tragedy of October 7th and the aftermath. And the pillars that once provided the stability for the community, every single one of them right now is being contested. I'll just read them through so you get a feel. The role of Israel and Zionism, obviously, the memory and meaning of the Holocaust, Jewish American exceptionalism, our sense of boundaries and belonging, the definition, the experience of anti-Semitism, the place and use of Jewish power and extreme Jewish wealth. These are all now sites of conflict, of rupture, and there are people that are writing about impending schism. So the past 2.5 years, right, have for many of us been very, very challenging. And they've been a marathon of grief, of sleeplessness, of moral vertigo. I think many of us are exhausted. We're worried about our children, the next generation. We're heartbroken for our families and friends in Israel. We're horrified by the level of death of innocent Palestinians. Whatever we feel about the justification or not, the vast destruction of Gaza. We're scared about anti-Semitism, the real anti-Semitism, and we're scared about the weaponization of anti-Semitism and how it's undermining democracy. And some of us are even unsure about the credibility of Judaism as a wisdom and way. The historian Yuval Harari, I don't know if you heard him, he said recently that he considered this period analogous to, its significance to Jewish history is analogous to the Churban, the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, he doesn't mean that Jews were killed at the same level and that every institution was destroyed and that the temple was destroyed or Israel was destroyed. He's making a claim that the paradigms around which we actually create, right, a Judaism, a Jewish community, a Jewish politics, right, that the paradigm itself is broken. And when a paradigm breaks, there is a Churban. Now, history will decide whether Harari is exaggerating or not, but we shouldn't be surprised then that we have an event like tonight, a panel, that suggests the Jewish tent is at a crossroads. I want to go a little further than that, because if we're really honest, first of all, there was never a Jewish tent the way we think, but let's imagine there was. The Jewish tent has been shredded. And we need to own that. At a moment in which it feels like many tents in America have been shredded. So of course, and now here I want to surface what all of us are feeling. There's a too muchness to what we're feeling at the moment. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of suspicion, there's a lot of rancor and anger and rage, there's guilt and shame, and there's sadness, and there's loss. I mean, if I would have put those in question, everybody could have answered. Everybody would have raised their hands for every single one. Maybe not guilt and shame, but then you'd feel guilty and shameful about not having raised your hand. And collectively, there's a lot of pain. There's Jewish pain, there's Israeli pain, there's Palestinian pain, there's American pain. It's impossible not to feel unnerved and destabilized and threatened by some part of the fractured body politic. There's some part of the politic that we are threatened by. So the big tent is over for the foreseeable future. We're not getting a big tent no more than we're getting the temple back. So the challenge is how to find a way to move forward with as much self-reflection and moral imagination and humility as Jews have used to get through churbans, to get through moments of destruction of a paradigm. And the only way to do that is create spaces of vulnerability, because only in spaces of vulnerability can new forms of collective intelligence emerge that are necessary, that can meet the challenge of the day. That's what I am hoping this panel is going to be about, that we can create a space. This is not a debate. I cannot tell you how many people I have to say this is not a debate. The range of the group of people is intentionally chosen. There is no one on the far right here. Oh my God, Gil Troy wanted to be here. I don't even know who that is. I mean, if Kahani was alive, he'd want to be here tonight. That's not what we have. We have 5 people, 4, thought-out positions who lead significant constituencies in the American Jewish politic and beyond, and everyone here shares a love for Judaism and a commitment to the safety of the Jewish people, and each is committed to the pursuit of justice and equality and dignity and peace for Jews and Palestinians as a religious imperative. And that is a group under crisis. That's the group under crisis now. And each has a distinct perspective. Last comment. BJ, we're here in BJ in the community. I'm not a member of BJ, but I'm an honorary member of BJ because I love the rabbis and I'm here plenty and I've spoken plenty. BJ is, the community is 250 years old, right? 200 years old. 200 years old. So I want you to take a moment and feel what the soul and souls of the community that hover about for 200 years have navigated. 200 years. They've navigated a civil war. They navigated all forms of poverty. They navigated immigration. They navigated world wars. They navigated depressions. They navigated Shoah. They navigated the establishment of the State of Israel. They navigated intense achievement. They navigated a roof falling down. They navigated the rebuilding. They navigated every type of life cycle and every type of emotion hovers in this room. And the community is here, 200, and we have been invited in by this community. So what I'd like us to do is to try to tap in to all of the different feelings. There's not a feeling, there's not a human feeling that was not experienced in the 250 years by all the souls that were part of the B'nai Jeshurun community. And I want to tap into that so that just maybe we can make it safe enough up here that they'll go off script a little bit. I'm going to try. You know, the higher you up as a leader, the more articulate you are, the more the script is so clear. But they can't go off script if we don't create the vulnerable space. And you know what's else important? If you're not vulnerable, all that'll happen here is you'll be affirmed in what you believe, right? You'll be angry about what you don't believe, which is really a waste of time. It's better to watch Stranger Things on Netflix. Okay? So I guess my hope is everybody leaves here, including me, and walk out and say, you know, at least for one thing, you know, I just never thought of it that way. Just one thing. Okay? And I guess we should start with the bracha, right? Baruch atah Adonai chonein hadat. Praise are you, God, who bestows wisdom upon us, because God knows We need a lot of wisdom. Okay, so I want each of you to take 3 minutes or so. You know, we have about 55 minutes. We have 4 people, and I'm actually one of the people, so we have 5 people. We have take 3 minutes or so, and I want you to offer your basic view. Sort of, if we were doing business speak, your elevator pitch, which you've given 1,000 times. You've given it to donors, and you've given it on TV, all of you. You've given it to newspapers, but not everybody here sort of has heard that. This sort of pitch, but I want you to frame it with this. And whoever goes first here, it's not fair, I know. But I want you to frame it this way. What's the anxiety? What's the problem? What's the fear? What's the nightmare that you are primarily responding to in your view? Because as leaders, as organizers, we design and evolve our views in order to mitigate some central anxiety or address some problem. Our views don't pop up into our heads. They're responses to something. We can go to Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, everybody in this room, and can get your views, and I mean this respectfully because I did this, almost better than you can give them. That's where we are. But you know what it can't do, Claude? And I asked Claude, you know what Claude can't do? Claude can't do. So Elliot, give me your take, but do a meta-take on your take while you're giving your take. What is it? What's sort of the nightmare to which your take is responding, or the unbearable future that your take is trying to prevent? And we'll go right up here. And I know it's not fair, you're going first, but.
Thank you, Rabbi, and it's great to be here on the west side, on the left side, the right side of the left side. And I do want to say, before I say what I want to say in the 3 minutes I've been allotted, that in my rabbinic career, it's very hard to have rabbinic heroes. And Rabbi Matalon, throughout the development of my career, has been a rabbinic hero and friend of mine. But what is unprecedented is that the succession plan should be to hand the mantle of leadership to a person who is in the pantheon of rabbinic heroes of mine, and that's Rabbi Sol. So I congratulate the BJ community on this moment. So I'll frame my anxiety by way of the Parsha, because every rabbi has to figure out what they're going to say on Shabbos. Moses is Moses. Why? There are 3 prequel narratives of Moses' life story prior to the burning bush. Number 1 is when he sees the Egyptian taskmaster beating the Israelite slave, and he intervenes, and his Jewish identity and sense of justice is triggered in that moment, and arguably that's a moment Moses becomes Moses and worthy of the burning bush. But we know, and I'm going to skip the middle story, the third story is at the well with the Midianites, and Moses intervenes, and he is empathetic on behalf of the stranger, not the Israelite, and that's story number 2. But the most interesting story is a middle story where Moses sees 2 Israelites in a brawl. And Moses intervenes at that moment and tries to stand in the breach, Omed Baparetz, and he stands in between the 2, and it's a muscle group that he is going to have to draw on over and over and over again, that Moses is Moses not simply because he intervenes on behalf of the Hebrew slave, not simply because he intervenes on behalf of the stranger, but because he intervenes when he sees 2 of his brethren going at it. and stands in that moment where he's going to have to do it at the golden calf, when he stands between God and Israel, and calms both sides, at the spies, at other moments in the biblical narrative. That is my primary fear, and that is my primary role right now, that in a moment of time when the Jewish people don't lack for external enemies, we are making internal enemies within our own tent. And I believe that the role of rabbinic leadership and all of leadership right now must be, that we restrain ourselves, as Rabbi you just said, from this need to call the other either a self-hating Jew or self-hating Zionist or whatever label you want to put on one side, and a colonial oppressor on the other side. That we need to find the dialogue, the suppleness, the capaciousness of spirit that allows us, and here I don't know if I differ with you or just a texture to it, I do believe that the tent needs to stand. We need to figure out a tent that is big enough that we can all be housed in it, that we can have an exchange of ideas as we're having here this evening, that we can enter uncomfortable and vulnerable spaces, that as one of the great rabbis of the past century, Arthur Hertzberg, said, you can't affirm your own certainties without engaging with the counter-certainties of another, and that is actually the indigenous rabbinic form of debate and dialogue, of an elu ve'elu, and that truth isn't in the possession of any one of us. And when it comes to the issues of the day, we need to model that in our communities, at our dinner tables, and in our family structures.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here at BJ. Thank you to all of the rabbis for hosting us, and Irwin for facilitating this conversation. I work, as many of you know, with rabbis. Trua, the organization I lead, has a membership of more than 2,300 rabbis across the US and Canada. And so I spend a lot of my time talking to rabbis who are desperately trying to keep together very fractured communities and fractured families. And I want to talk a little bit about that anxiety and where I see it coming from, particularly around Israel, which is, of course, what is fracturing our community. So on the one hand, you have, I don't know if mainstream is actually the right word, or legacy organizations that are trying to hold on to this fantasy of Israel and this fantasy of Zionism that doesn't actually represent what is happening in Israel or in the world. And you have a situation in which many of these legacy organizations for decades have been saying, look, if you want to care about Israel, if you want to be a Zionist, this is how you do it. You have to ignore occupation. You have to ignore Israel's slide into a liberal democracy. You have to defend Israel at every turn. You can't publicly criticize, and anybody who publicly criticizes, or anybody who brings a pro-Palestinian position, or anybody who is Palestinian is automatically deemed an anti-Semite. So you have that voice, and increasingly that side of the community is also saying that in order to defend, it's not even defending Israel, it's defending the current government of Israel and its policies, that they will give up all other values, including democracy. We see a community that's moving away from historic commitments to immigration, to democracy, and trying to, in many cases, curry favor with the current administration, which has no need for democracy. Elliot started us off talking about the Parsha, but actually in order to understand this Parsha, you have to go back to the story of Joseph. Joseph, of course, is the first Jew who manages to get a high position in a non-Jewish court and get close to the leader in a way that saves the Jewish people. It saves his family. I don't want to criticize him, but the thing that he learns, or at least several generations later, that the Jewish people learn is that that closeness doesn't protect us forever, that there's always a backlash, and that's how this Parsha starts. So you have a legacy community that's holding on to this vision of Israel and defending the Israeli government at all costs, including, over the last couple of years, defending war crimes, denying starvation, ignoring the pain and suffering in Gaza. And unsurprisingly, you have a generation, a young generation, who's never known an Israel without Netanyahu at the helm, or almost never, and never known an Israel, never known the possibility of peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. And looks around and says, well, if you're telling me that Zionism means defending occupation and defending a liberal democracy, I want no part of that. I see what's happening in Gaza. And so we see this fracturing where we have these two poles. But when we look at polls, P-O-L-L-S, not the other kind of poll, we see that actually the majority of the Jewish community feels deeply connected to Israel, is very much against this government, against occupation, for two states, and that is the largest part of our actual community, but you wouldn't know that by the loudest voices. And so it's really important, this is what we do at TRUA, and many other organizations and leaders also do that, is that we can say that we can both mourn the horrific tragedy of October 7th and mourn the Israelis who were killed, and for almost 2 years we fought for the return of the hostages alongside Israelis who were on the street, and we can also mourn the just unbearable deaths in Gaza and call out Israel's war crimes there. Like, we can do it all. It's not actually that hard. We actually have space to mourn for both people, and that is both where the Jewish community is, but it's also a voice that is very much not heard or not heard enough, and that we have to make louder.
Oh, this is a hard question that you ask. My name is Esther Sperber. I just got back from Israel, and I'm going to really make this the most personal I think I can. I was born and grew up in Israel. I'm the oldest of 10 siblings. Most of them are there, as are my parents. And somehow I happened to move here like all Israelis. I came for 2 years, 20-something years ago. I think there are two things that scare me the most. I think on the most personal level, it's the fact that amongst my very diverse and wonderful and incredible siblings, it's almost become impossible for us to talk about both American Jewry and the views here, and obviously what's happening in Israel. We've kind of divided into, there's me and two sisters who kind of agree. Then there's a sister and two brothers who we can't talk to, and I've actually not unfriended them on Facebook, but unfollowed them so I don't have to see the things that they post, because it feels immoral to not respond when you see something that you think is so harsh and so unkind and so unjust written, but it also seems really kind of pathetic to fight with your siblings on Facebook. And then there are those who are kind of like willing to talk to everyone. And actually, just before I went to Israel, one of my sisters who lives in the West Bank in a really sweet little settlement by the Dead Sea that probably hasn't displaced anyone, but nevertheless, it's illegal in my mind, told me that she feels like she can't talk to me anymore, and has been kind of not answering my phone calls. I didn't realize she was not picking up, not because she was just busy. We did end up having a really wonderful conversation on Shabbat, where both of us were able to talk about why I feel that Israel is going in a self-destructing direction, both morally and politically and socially. And she was able to tell me how my criticism of the war in Gaza feels like a kind of slap in the face of people like her who have put so much effort into trying to protect Israel and feel a sense of deep trauma and deep anxiety and deep insecurity. And so I think that is my first kind of vignette, the fact that even in a very, very personal sense, in a family that has been able to really kind of manage many challenges, this has become kind of the most almost impossible moment. And I think the only other little piece of this that I would like to add is that I think the thing that drove me to become more of an activist in both in the Israeli judicial overall protest and the hostages, and now with our organization Smol Emuni, which translates as Faithful Left, a home for Orthodox and observant people who are looking to have a different conversation about Israel and acknowledge the wrongfulness of the occupation and the rights of Palestinians and Israelis. Is the sense that much that we hear that we hear a kind of admiration of power and vengeance and brutality that is using our Jewish tradition as its justification. People talking about Palestinians as Amalek, a kind of mythical nation that is supposed to be destroyed. My sense is that kind of using Smotrich, and it's not just Smotrich, but that our Judaism has been Smotriched away from us, and that we need to find a way to bring it back into a place that's morally grounded in our Torah and in our kind of democratic and liberal values.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I guess just before I answer the question, I want to say that I know there are people in the room here and probably online who profoundly disagree with my point of view. And I just want to say to the person in the room who thinks they disagree most profoundly, I want to say I am so grateful to you for being here. I have such deep admiration for people who go out of their way to listen to views that they passionately disagree with. It's rare. In the Jewish community, it's rare in the United States. People generally like to go to hear people who reaffirm what they already believe. It says in Pirkei Avot, who is wise? The one who learns from all people. And I feel like the person who's traveled the furthest ideological distance to listen is showing the greatest wisdom. So thank you deeply. I guess I have twin nightmares. I mean, the first nightmare is about people I know in Gaza. A friend I know who grew up in Gaza told me about a conversation he had with a woman he grew up with, and she said, there's no clean water. I have no breast milk. My infant is crying uncontrollably. My question to you is, how do I stay sane? Another Palestinian friend who has been working to try to get a group of girls out of Gaza, incredibly talented group of girls. It's one girl she's been working with. There were no sanitary pads, so she used part of the tent, and they have been able to get her out, but she got an infection, has now been sterilized. Third Palestinian person I know from Gaza told me that they had this tradition in his family where they would wish happy birthday on Facebook to all of their relatives. He has dozens and dozens of relatives in Gaza, and he was doing it after October 7th. And he finally got a message from one relative who said, for God's sake, stop. Don't you understand how many of the people you've wished happy birthday to are now dead? So my one nightmare is that when I'm called to account by Hashem, by my grandchildren, I will not be able to answer the question of what I did in this moment for those people and for all the people like them who've been suffering in that way, that I was indifferent, or complicit, and that the community and the people that I love was indifferent or worse. So that's one nightmare. The second nightmare is that I will be left without any community at all. It's very, Shabbat is not Shabbat if you spend it alone. And I sometimes feel like that's my future. I love nothing more than to go to other cities and walk into a shul and feel like I can sit and daven and listen and just feel part of it. And oftentimes now, if I'm going overseas tomorrow, I feel like I feel fearful about telling people my name. I worry about the consequences for my children, about carrying the last name they carry, and what that will mean for their ability, especially in the more traditional and more observant Jewish communities that have given me everything, that are my sustenance, where I've raised my kids, that I adore more than I can possibly say. But I know that the political positions that I feel impelled to take because of my analysis of the moral crisis that we face are ones that make me an alien or worse in the spaces that I love most deeply. And I know that Esther was talking of a version of that crisis, personal crisis, is felt by many, many, many people. And so that's my other nightmare, is that we won't be able to have a path through that crisis, and people will lose relations. I've already lost relationships with some of the people in the world that I admire the most and have taught me the most. My nightmare is that I will continue to lose those relationships because I can't find a way of communicating to people effectively that, as profoundly as they may disagree with the positions that I've taken, that I do it out of love for our people and our tradition, and that other people who are in a similar position like me may also fail.
I have all these notes, and they don't matter because now I want to make the conversation live for a second. First of all, can everybody feel, not think for a second, could everybody feel the pain of each nightmare? Okay? And I really mean that. Everybody here is very smart. Okay? Everybody there is very smart. But we've become too smart. Do you feel the pain of what it would really, 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 really feel like if the tent was so shredded? That's what Elliot picked up on. So shredded that the internal division was so significant that we wouldn't have redemption, that we wouldn't have a future, that we wouldn't locate the Moshes. I don't mean like what we have now. That's the nightmare. To wake up every morning, to have to give talks every Shabbos, and to have that as your nightmare. What would it feel like? What would it feel like? What does it feel like? How painful it is to wake up every morning and know the majority of people that Jill deals with, majority of rabbis, majority of people that those rabbis represent, the majority actually score out in polls in a way that their voice is not heard in the, and you're right, it's the legacy institution and the donor class as presently constructed in American Jewish life. How painful that is. She talks to people and works with people who work with literally thousands, 2,300 times, even 200, 300, 500. Can you feel the pain of a loving family, came from extraordinary parents, people who cannot talk to each other, who have a more common language, Jewish language, than probably almost anyone in this room? Can you feel the pain of knowing people on the other side who are suffering so much that you worry about, wow, what if I'm called to account? And that the fact of worrying about that and having a view to mitigate that internal nightmare poses a risk of feeling alien to the very community that you love. See, until we can feel it deeply, nothing can move. Nothing can move. So now I want a second round, and we'll go the same thing. So Elliot, I get the internal division. I mean, my whole career has been, klal and pluralism, and pluralism in the tent is always, pluralism is tested not when I have to include someone who doesn't like someone, but I know how to hold those two together, views. Pluralism is tested when there's a view that makes me profoundly uncomfortable. In fact, a view that may even disgust me. That's where the pluralism rubber meets the road. I'm curious if there are spaces over the last 2 years, year and a half year, 2 months, where that line for you on the internal division, not for someone else. Like, we know how to include a lot of people who can't include each other. But for you, there's been some shift, oh man, this is testing my inclusiveness or my capacity for big tenting.
Right now.
Good, go.
Not self-evident to me that I was going to be on this panel. I ask myself actively whether I want to qualify this by saying that words are slippery, and what the word Zionist, non-Zionist, anti-Zionist means to one person, it's different to another person. But for me, to engage in dialogue with someone who is a non-Zionist or an anti-Zionist is pushing me way out of my comfort level. I believe in Shabbat, in Kashrut, in certain tenets of faith. I didn't choose to be born into this time of Jewish history, but I was, and I believe that because I was, not just as a rabbi, but as a Jew, engagement with the modern state of Israel is a constituent building block of what it means to be a Jew today, and to sidestep that is a position which I find to be not just dangerous, but it doesn't make sense to me that one can imagine a world without a Jewish state. And so I find myself challenged, but in those moments, my North Star is Ahavat Yisrael, love of Israel, not simply the state of Israel, but love of the Jewish people. And that is the ballast in these moments, whether it is people to the left of me or people to the right of me, because I am trying really, really hard to work to keep these Jewish people together by my own actions and my own deeds. I am putting myself both with people to the left and with people to the right. I'm trying to understand their positions. I'm trying to maintain a dialogue with those people, and I'm trying to model something that hopefully other people can bring into their own lives.
Great. Jill, it's a similar question off of your nightmare. What given that, like, I don't know, for 30 years now or so, let's say, Rabin's assassination, so a little more than 30 years, that I understand, like Zionism, liberal Zionism, or whatever we mean by liberal Zionism, this sort of Zionism that takes, the dignity, a sense of equality and justice, and believes that the two-state solution, and I know that Trua actually, you take the two-state solution very, very serious. It's still viable for you, right? Given that by every measure in the last 30 years, liberal Zionism, and I'm in that community still, every position, view, posture, position of power, just about, in Israel for sure, and in America in the seats of power, in the seats of Jewish power, we've regressed. What is it? If we're, I put it this way, if we're so smart, and we're so morally and psychologically evolved, and we're so correct, how is it, what do you think, how is it that our nightmare, and here I'm with you, I'm actually with all of you on this, how is it that your nightmare is coming true? Or how do you account for it, or what do you think about that? I don't mean you're not, but it's heart to heart because we are very similar in where we situate ourselves.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to make a historical argument. I mean, I could sit here and say, well, here's the choice point, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think I really want to make a historical argument. But I just want to really stay inside of the question of the Jewish community and to go back, not quite 30 years, but my very first kind of progressive Israel activism was while I was in rabbinical school. I was ordained at JTS in 2003, and I was in Israel the first year of the Second Intifada, 2000, 2001, and the following year, there was, some of you might have been there was a big rally on the Mall in DC. I think it was in the spring, must have been around the spring of 2002, and a group of us from a bunch of rabbinical schools, not just JTS, but some of the other schools, were very nervous about whether to go down. Like the whole East Coast was shutting down, all the schools, JTS was bringing buses, everyone was bringing buses, and we knew that some of what was going to be said there was going to be anti-Palestinian, racist, and we had suffered through, we had spent a year trying not to get blown up. And, so that was very real to us, but we also understood what was happening on the other side and ended up going about 100 of us as rabbinical students for a just peace. We called ourselves, and we had signs that said things that would feel so parv right now, like we believe in peace, it's really parv, and got screamed at and, sent a letter to a bunch of legacy organizations, some of whose leaders are still around or retired very recently, and got some pretty condescending responses. Nobody would meet with us, but they gave the condescending responses to the press. And basically, I can look back and I can say, oh, look, we were right? And there's something that's very, it can be very self-satisfactory to say, like, if anybody had listened to us rabbinical students, 20 years ago, we'd be in a different place. But that doesn't really get us anywhere. And so we can go back and examine all of the mistakes that everybody made. And that's often how conversations about Israel-Palestine go. People say, like, well, if the Palestinians had just, accepted the partition, if the Israelis had just this, if this group had just accepted this map, like, that's great, but we can't actually go back and change history. So the question then is, how can we move forward? And is there a path to move forward where we say, look, two states, the status quo is clearly not working, right? That has become, if it wasn't clear before, it's become really clear over the last 2 years. The status quo is not working. We can't have permanent occupation. We can't have, this war in Gaza was so much worse than any war before, and October 7th was so much worse than any terror attack before, but we just can't repeat this cycle and have it just get worse every time. And we also know that Israelis and Palestinians aren't going anywhere, right? There's like I think close to 10 million Israeli citizens, about 80% Jewish, 20% Palestinian, plus another 5 million Palestinians who are living under occupation. And like they're staying. So there's not a solution in which half of the people leave and go live somewhere else. That's not a solution. There shouldn't be a solution in which one group of people live under the rule of the other group of people. And so then the question is what the solution is. I still believe that the most practical solution is two states. It's the one certainly doesn't have anywhere near majority support, but more support than any other solution among people on the ground, both Israelis and Palestinians. And the fact that political leaders haven't made it happen before doesn't mean it's impossible. Like, imagine if over the last 30 years, the American Jewish community had put all of our Hasbara money, all of our money that was put into defending Israel and denying occupation and trying to educate students, kids to do advocacy. What if we had put all of that money into civil society and peace building and advocating for a just solution? We could be in a totally different place. And so we can look back and lament what we didn't do, or we can say, well, that's actually a way to move forward. Let's envision what we think is possible and actually work for it. And working for it means that we are not just saying two states like it's some kind of mantra. Like every Jewish organization, Israel organization, even AIPAC says two states. They don't actually mean it because they're also propping up occupation. So how do we not only say two states, but put facts in the ground that will make it possible?
I'll have, again, a similar off of your nightmare. Esther, if over the next 12 to 36 months, and this isn't to depress people, this is so that we understand the seriousness of the crisis in liberal Zionism and faithful left, because that's not liberal Zionism, but it's a particular kind of Zionism that is different than a Smotrich Zionism, okay? Because that's where the crisis is, right? Ben Gvir's not getting up in the morning and saying, there's a crisis in my Zionism. By the way, and I don't want to use American Jewish names, and as I know a lot, mostly, so isn't many American Jewish legacy leaders. They're not saying there's a crisis the way we're talking about this crisis. The crisis is because there's something that we're going to have to organize around at a much higher level if the form of Zionism and the viability of the sorts of things that at least Elliot, and we're going to get to you, Elliot and Jill and Esther are talking about, that we're going to have to ratchet up and think through at levels that we are not yet at. And it's going to be very uncomfortable. That was Elliot's discomfort. We're going to have to go places and make sacrifices at levels that we're not prepared to make. So here's for Jill. You're doing something that seems to be really, really difficult. Esther, I'm sorry, because I'm looking at Jill. It's something very, very difficult that in many ways, the belly of the form of Zionism that is both the strongest form of Zionism right now in Jewish life and the most enabled in the American scene. You're trying to say there is another religious way. By the way, I meet Christians who are trying to do this in white Christian nationalism, right, every day. Really not so easy, right? Observant, frum Christians, right? Working to try to create a different form of Christianity in America that has real influence and power. If in the next 12 to 36 months, their election happens and actually, a right of center gets elected and it's not creeping annexation, but it really is annexation, and it's okay, and we can understand how it would work in America. I mean, after all, we just invaded Venezuela. Annexation is nothing, and you could see it happening, and it's it creeps upon you, and we're there 36 months from now, that actually there's some red line. I don't know what that red line would be for you. I don't know what it would be for any of us. That red line is crossed where, wow, even for me, there's a red line. First of all, could you imagine there is a red line that you would say, you know what? This can't work. Or is your faith statement that no matter what, I'm staying in the game? And I know that's a hard question, but I think we have to go there to probe. You have to do what we have to probe where our edge is. So either we're so damn frightened of that edge, because that edge may be Peter, that we're so frightened of that edge that we ratchet up our level of engagement with the reimagining of the form of Zionism that we think has the moral and deep moral credibility, right? So I guess the question is, could you imagine 36 months? Is there a line for you that would say this, wow, no, this is what happened, or that is not even conceivable?
Or I think before I go to that line, I want to stay one more moment in in uncertainty and in that moment of anxiety, because I think part of what we're talking about here is, for me, there are two different levels. There's a political question, which is the question of what happens in the land of Israel, what happens to the Jews, what happens to the Palestinians, what kind of political structure can work and give equality and justice and freedom to all those people. That is a question that Jill has much more confidence, and I think maybe Peter has more confidence than I have. And I'm willing to say that I'm not sure how we solve this political problem. What I am very sure about is our moral obligation. And I am sure that what is happening now is wrong. And I'm sure that part of the problem was that we never were willing to confront the somewhat paradoxical image that we want to have of a Jewish and democratic state. And that doesn't mean that that's not possible, but I think it's a problem that we have kind of shied away from looking at, and that goes to 1967, but that also goes to 1948. And that question is that repressed, in psychoanalytic language, I would say it's that repressed problem that keeps haunting us and haunting us and haunting us. And until we are willing to have a conversation about it, I think we're going to remain in this kind of repetitive nightmare. I do think that kind of the Jewish way is not always just to widen the tent to include everyone. I think that is one piece of it. But we also have in our tradition other modes of operating, and we have many books of prophets who were not promoting unity. They were calling out injustice, and they were often telling people, you think this is comfortable and this is going to work and you can rely on these Egyptians or Babylonians, and actually you're going on the wrong way, and what you need to do is repent. And I think that is kind of tshuva, this idea that when something bad happens, you must search within yourself and try to see what you did wrong, is, I think, the piece of this terrible time that feels the most useful for me and the most deeply meaningful. And each of us is going to find different explanations for what we did wrong, and maybe different explanations for how to do better. But I think you can't just go on doing what you did up to now.
Actually, that's great. You're really saying that it's too early. My question's too early. We haven't even really, you're not criticizing, but you're inviting us to think we haven't even really done the work. And if you don't do the work, why would you expect to have any sort of new ways of relating and connecting? if you don't do the work. You have to do the work. And maybe we haven't, and that's a really interesting take. So Peter, now here's for you. I had a strange experience in preparing, because I, of course, read your book again, and I know you for a long time, and I listen. I'm there on Fridays at noon, or sometimes 1, or sometimes 11, sometimes Wednesdays. I'm there, and I follow you. I always say I'm not there yet. I was struck how you're actually much more threatening. You may get more threats from violent people on the right, but you actually are far more threatening if my conversations and emails and with people, since it was announced I was moderating this, you're actually much more threatening to good liberal Zionists. And I was really struck by that, because when I thought of a continuum, I thought, like, here you got, sort of whatever we mean by the right wing, militant sovereign state, and then you have Jewish sovereignty just can't work anymore, right? It's not situational, it's structural. And that's reducing, but it's structural. And I thought, that's the poles. But actually, that's not the poles. Or that is one of the poles. Another pole is, there's nothing more threatening to liberal Zionists than someone who says, you're not viable, in a nice way, you're not viable anymore. And I don't know if it's because you've given up faith. When the house is burning, do you walk away from a house that's burning? And I'm saying this all out of love, right, and deep respect. Do you walk out of the house when the house is burning? Or is that the wrong metaphor? Right? Or what you're doing is you're actually spraying water on, but the water, when the hose hits you, is cold. And it's not the house is burning, it's that we need to get our attention, and you're doing that. So I want to ask you this. You've traveled the country probably more than any Jewish thought leader, not the country, actually Europe too, and Australia, and so you've been in a lot of places. You've traveled more since your book, you've traveled more than probably any Jewish thought leader in the much more than recent past. You've spoken in more Jewish communities. You've spoken, I see you on CNN, we all see you on really one of the few Jewish thought leaders in the public space, and Jewish, out of Jewish thought. It's not out of only a political progressive tradition. I'm curious is there anything that you've learned in how you communicate, and you're a communicator, you're a writer, how you communicate that, prophets are, if you are a prophet, prophets are never heard in their own line, and they actually die alienated. And they die alone. Relatively.
Luckily, I'm not a prophet,
right.
then.
So luckily you're not a prophet. But on the other hand, their message lasts a long, long, long time. We're still chanting the Haftorah. Is there anything that you've learned in communicating with more people than probably any Jewish thought leader, right, in America over the last 2 years, about your own communication that might be more effective in getting liberal Zionists' attention and not enable?
I think this thing that strikes me again and again is how limited my capacity is to change anybody's mind. And I think that could spring from all kinds of deficiencies in my own speaking and writing. But I think a lot of it is ultimately that what happens is the conversation becomes a conversation about the Palestinians. Why are they doing this? What would they do in this circumstance? How do they think about things? And I'm not a Palestinian. So sometimes people kind of want me to speak for Palestinians, but it's absurd. It's absurd, right? And so I think the thing that I'm reminded again and again and again is that if I can play any role, the most constructive role I could play is to nudge people a little bit to listen to Palestinians. Because it's only the experience of listening to Palestinians that can start to give you the information that you need to make these decisions about policy and future. And I also think it's only listening to Palestinians that makes people confront their dehumanization of Palestinians. Because I think that one of the most powerful experiences for many Jews is listening to Palestinians and thinking, this person doesn't seem like they want to kill me. This person seems just as committed to life and to the values that I cherish and is every bit as smart and thoughtful as me, and I am surprised by that. And what does it say about me that I am surprised that this Palestinian is every bit as human as I am? And I can't create that experience. The best I could do is just to nudge people to say, have you thought about inviting a Palestinian speaker to your shul, or your Jewish day school, or your community center? Have you thought about assigning a book by a Palestinian writer? So I think that, to me, it's the ball game, really. And I would say, I do think one thing that I find hard sometimes is to be constantly told that I am naive about Palestinians. And then to ask people, the people who tell me again and again, I am naive, dangerously naive, right? Genocidally dangerously naive. And I say, I am working with very imperfect information. I recognize I'm not an Arabic speaker. I have lots that I know. In fact, one of the things that strikes me again and again when I talk to Palestinians is how little I know. But I will say that I talk to Palestinians on a continual basis. Many Palestinians. And so I turn to the people who say, you are so naive about Palestinians. And I say, as gently as I can, as kindly as I can, how many Palestinians are you talking to? You know? And I will say that for those people who think people like me, who believe that Jews and Palestinians can live safely alongside each other, equally under the law, based on the principle that if all human beings are created equal in the image of God, the political corollary is that states should treat people equally under the law. We can have special bonds and loves and affiliations to our families and our communities, but a state is a different thing with its brutal coercive power, that the state should not create tiers of people based on religion, race, or gender or ethnicity. And we are fighting that fight in the United States for people who want America to become a Christian and democratic country. And I think the crisis that we are facing, that young American Jews are forcing us to recognize, is to ask their parents, how can you be fighting against the idea of ethno-nationalism and a Christian and democratic country and simultaneously be defending the principle of ethno-nationalism in Israel, Palestine? Because if you sacrifice a principle when it matters most, you don't believe in the principle. And the thing I would most want people who disagree with me to grapple with is, why is it that so frequently the Jews who spend the most time with Palestinians, who spend the most time listening to Palestinians, who are most engaged with Palestinians in a human interaction, are the ones who are most confident that actually we don't need a state based on Jewish supremacy in order to be safe?
Okay. No, don't do that. Don't do that. Do this. If you applauded, it's like this when you read a text. So imagine this is a text. When you read a text, like a Torah text, so unfortunately, we tend to read the text, and what comes out to us is what we agree with in the text, right, first. So some character, we say, oh, that character, Cain and Abel, oh my God. We go, yeah, oh my God, Cain, oh my God, he killed Abel, terrible. And you identify, right, with the good character. You have good, bad, and you create a binary, and you identify with one and disidentify with the other. But it turns out that's the least interesting way to read a text. Whatever you identify with, if you want to grow, you have to disidentify with and turn it into an object so that you could look at it and see, why is it that I was attracted to that? Why is it that sort of turned me on? Why is it that I can't? Why is it that I hate Cain? Right? The more you disidentify with the Cain and the Cain and Abel story, the more you are Cain. right? But it's hard to identify, it's hard to identify with Cain. But the thing about Abel, he's dead. So it's not so good to identify with Abel. Okay, so when you want to applaud, what you want to say is, my applauding is actually blocking some growth, even though I do agree. You don't have to change your mind, but it's blocking some growth. And if you want to hiss and you want to boo, it's okay, I get it. Okay, I mean, I hate the Boston Celtics. Okay, so I hate them. So
You may have just hit the limits of my tent.
yeah, good, perfect. So when you want to boo, it's okay. It's okay. I mean, don't boo because we were told not to boo. But remember that the reason you're booing is it is some form of defending against something that's very painful that you need to sort of get at if you want to grow. And that may be a real key to the ability for whatever we mean by a form of liberal Zionism to be able to reimagine itself, right? And so I want to.
Is it
yeah,
okay?
Please.
Can we dialogue with each other?
Yeah, go.
All right, because I'm concerned, because this is a public forum, that me sitting here quietly would signal
Affirm.
assent with anything that's being said here tonight.
Good.
And no. Let's all play by the rules, but I want to do it in the spirit of dialogue here, because Peter, because I begin with I agree with your premise, because I think that my starting point for my Jewish theology is that each and every person is created equally with the infinite dignity as bestowed by them by their Creator. And so the suffering of Palestinians is of my concern and needs to be spotlighted, and that has to go hand in hand, Palestinian self-determination with Israeli self-determination and Israeli sovereignty. I guess my concern, and we've spoken about this before, is a non-Zionism, anti-Zionism view would be co-opted by others, concede the language to those who actually seek harm to the Jewish people, and most of all, because I believe, tactically speaking, that this was indicated by Esther and Gil, that you make change, effectuate change from within the tent. And so why not try to effectuate change from within the tent of those who defend Jewish sovereignty?
And what's the pivot? There was a moment where, because you were inside the tent, and there was a moment, I think Elliot said, that moment, which is coming for more and more young people, and that's a scary thing, right, for many of us, that moment came for you, and you said, you know what, I'm not in this tent. I'm going to be, sort of nudging from outside the tent. That's a really good question.
Yes, please go. I don't want to.
No.
It's a two-way conversation. So.
Can I jump in for a moment? And I'll let you answer this. I want to say, it's funny, I mentioned Facebook before. It sounds like I'm all day on Facebook. But my Facebook feed used to be kind of a mix of architecture, which is my profession, Israelis, Americans, English, Hebrew. Somehow the algorithm over the last 2 years, probably based on my attention, has kind of shifted towards extreme lefty Israelis. And so that's a lot of what I see. And I guess my question for you, Elliot, about your question to Peter is, it's not a big group, but there is a legitimate kind of strand of Israeli, I don't know if you want to call it Zionism because it's a complicated word, but of Israeli political thought since 1948, and definitely in the last few years, that sees a kind of Peter-esque solution as the more logical one, given that there are 700,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank and nobody is moving, and this should just, I guess my question is if there are people in Israel, both Jews and Palestinians, who see this as a legitimate political stance, why is it illegitimate when Peter says this? Or do you just think the belief that Israel has to be a Jewish sovereign state is kind of an article of faith that can't be questioned?
Okay, so first, Peter, you respond first, and then you'll hear both, and then no, and that's okay, Elliot. And this is good. This is good. This is good. It's why outside the tent.
I spent most of my adult life, as a liberal Zionist who supported the idea of partition. I think what forced me to question that, if I had to put it in the name of one person, it's a man named Hassan Hamimi, who often comes to my calls on Fridays. I often see him as the first. He's probably in his 80s now. He and his family were forced out of Jaffa in 1948. Beautiful, beautiful older man. Reminds me in some ways of my father, of blessed memory. And I have to look him in the face. When I was a liberal Zionist, I didn't have to do that as much. I was really almost always only in Jewish spaces. And in Jewish spaces, it's not so hard. You say, listen, you got to move on. You got to move on. You move on. Bad things happen. People move on. You have to give up on the desire in his case, to go back to Jaffa, to the place where he grew up. But it's harder when you look people in the eye, and you see that his love of that place, his desire to be able to, I don't know if he wants to live there, move there permanently, or just be able to go back and forth and be equal there, or whatever, have the ability that we have to go back, that when you look someone in the eye and you see that his love of that place is absolutely every bit as deep as my love of that land. And then you say, wait a second, I'm telling this guy after 75 years to get over it? I mean, we are telling a group of people to get over it? We who nurtured the memory of this land for 2,000 years, we are the world champions of not getting over it. But I have to tell him to get over it. I have to tell him, sorry, Hassan, you're not going to be able to go back to Jaffa before you die, because we have to maintain a Jewish majority. And if you come and your kids come, it could go down. It could get to 75% or 70% or 65% or, God forbid, 49%. And, Jews have to rule. And then I hear myself and I feel like I am in a company of people and part of a discourse that is not the discourse that reflects my basic values. And so I think that's why I went off the derech.
You can also respond to both, but it's good.
I do take it as an article of faith. Yeah. I'm a believer. I believe that, not only in the Jewish claim to the land, and I believe that the last 2,000 years prior to 1948 is a pretty powerful and sustained case statement of the problematics that come with vulnerability, landlessness, exile, and persecution. Now, my conundrum is that there's another people who has another claim to that same piece of real estate that I am laying claim to as a Jew, as a Zionist. Which is why I come back to some sort of position that calls for some, I'm a classic two-stater, and I believe that it will make everyone somewhat unhappy, but as a Zionist, I believe that Palestinian self-determination is in the best interest of the Palestinians and in the best interest of the Jewish of Jews. And I think that in Israel, on any given Saturday night or on any given moment, there are thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people who are expressing their dissent with the Israeli government as an expression of their love of country, no different than I do as an American. So I think that tent can be a very expansive tent that's capable of housing a plurality of opinions as to how Israel can lay claim to its values, which are more elusive than ever, of being a Jewish and democratic state, but that remains the vision, and that's what I work towards.
First say something about the Torah and something about the politics, because they're not the same. So I also start in that place of human beings being created in the image of God. That's the very first thing that we learn about human beings in the Torah, and that both means that we are due the ultimate dignity just like we would offer to God, and it also imposes responsibilities on us to treat every other human being as a creation in the image of God. And the Torah is eternal, and it operates under any political arrangement. The Torah doesn't dictate a specific political arrangement. So the Torah has been eternal through all sorts of political arrangements. Let's say, I don't know if they're good, but bad, worse, even worse. And perhaps we'll figure out the right one eventually. So I don't think that you can move directly from Torah to saying, therefore, we have to have a particular political arrangement. The Jews in 1948 or before decided that we would, the innovation of Zionism was not, of course, creating the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. The innovation of Zionism was to say that we can use modern political means, including appealing to world powers, to try to return to the land of Israel, to our ancient homeland, and not wait for divine intervention. And of course, you can't talk about Zionism without the context of a moment when lots of minorities were trying to get minority rights and trying to get their own states, and this moment when empire was falling and nation states were rising. And nation states, of course, are ethno-states. There's some, of course, created history around every nation state, but essentially they're created around a nation. And the United States is different. I think you can't really impose the United States or take the model of the United States and try to impose that on other places, because the United States is different because, unlike other places in the world, it wasn't created as an ethno-state or as a nation state in the same way. So I want to say that it's very easy to say, well, we have this vision of what can be in the United States. How come we're not going to try to create that in Israel? Because it doesn't really exist almost anywhere else in the world. So that's one piece. I want to say also about Zionism. Look, I think we get really caught up in talking about Zionism and what it is, and liberal Zionism, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't think the word is serving us well. I think we should talk about what is actually happening in the place and how we can move forward. But just to say a word about Zionism, Zionism was never one thing, right? Like, there were lots of visions for, are the Jews going to live as subjects of the Ottoman Empire or the British Empire later on? Is there going to be a binational state? Do we need a state, right? There were lots and lots of visions. And really, in the decades before 1948, particularly 1929, 1936, when there was a lot of violence in general, right? It wasn't just Palestinians against Jews, it was in both directions. That vision really came to a crashing halt. And in the end, we got a very imperfect, to say the least, solution. But that doesn't mean that there's not a solution that allows both Jews and Palestinians to enjoy national sovereignty, for both national movements to achieve their dream. And ideally, that doesn't mean having a Jewish state or a Palestinian state doesn't mean that there's Jewish supremacy or Palestinian supremacy. I would hope that there will be a Palestinian minority inside a Jewish state, God willing, maybe a Jewish minority inside of a Palestinian state with full equal rights both as individuals and also as a community, and that is possible. But that said, we can sit here and try to design all kinds of plans and argue about politics, and very often the conversations start with, is it two states, is it one state, is it confederation, which is two states more in the EU model of two states with an open border, right? We can talk about that, but ultimately we have to have a solution that begins with nobody is going anywhere, everybody deserves to live, And over the last couple of years, unfortunately, from both the far left and from the far right, we've seen a lot of voices that have essentially said, one half of the people there don't deserve to be there, and we need voices that say, everybody deserves to be here. That's the principle we're starting on, and then let's figure out what the political solution is. And I think there's multiple political solutions. Again, I think 2 states is the one that is the most workable, but it doesn't mean that either of the states has to have, has to include discrimination against its minority population.
I want to stay on American Jews. I'm struck that I remember Rabin coming to AIPAC right after right after the Oslo Accords were signed, and Rabin got up, and I was at that AIPAC conference, and he basically said, "You're not a serious. I don't really care what you think. You're not really serious people to me, and we're the strongest we've ever been. We're going to make peace now, and I don't care what you do, and you have no power anyhow." And it was a very unnerving thing for the AIPAC crowd, that moment. And then I remember a book, I forget his name right now, Walter, who wrote, he gave the history sort of Zionism in America. And what? No, Walter, oh God, it's his historian, American historian, doesn't matter. And he wrote how actually Jews have had very little impact on the American political attitudes towards Israel. Israel's been very important for a whole variety of reasons, but then actually we haven't been as important as we think relative to. So I want to stay on America, and I want to do 2 last questions, okay? Because we have very little impact. One is, and this is 3 of the 7 questions that came from young people, and essentially, they say, if Zionism means, whatever Zionism means, what's going on in Gaza and everything that's happening there, and I don't see any examples of a better Zionism, how should I be expected to believe in a better Zionism if all I see is violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And I want to put it this way. There's something happening in which there's a sort of return of what I call the usable past. And Esther, or Jill, you mentioned that there's been a lot of form of Zionisms. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about what it means to live on the land. I mean, we can go through the Walter Benjamins and the Hannah Arendts and that. We can go through the Satmar and the anti-Zionist religious part. There's so much more parts of the usable past that are usable. There are 2 books recently that I think have been very important. Shalom Agid's book, The Necessity of Exile, and David Kramer's really, really important book, and David I know is here, Embracing Exile, which I really encourage everybody to read, where we're recovering a different way of telling the story. That diaspora and exile, it isn't all about that we're the persecuted and we're vulnerable with that. It's much more complicated than that. I mean, especially if you read Kramer's book. And the necessity of exile, that's from a more theological, how central the experience of exile has been in the very development of Judaism itself, and how essential it may have been, and that history is contingent. So I'm struck that as that explodes, and it explodes, obviously, young people read it first, a lot of these things, because academics put it into the curriculum, that our young people are going to see a much wider range of the Jewish past. I even, my daughter went to Michigan, she had a Palestinian friend, so this whole thing of meeting Palestinians, I didn't meet any Palestinians, right? I'm 68 years old, I just turned 68, so I still think I'm 67. The next generation's meeting Palestinians in a way that I didn't, that maybe you didn't, but now do. What do you say to a young person who says this, that if Judaism is going to be, if Zionism is going to be a faith statement of Judaism, that it's going to be inextricably tied together, and that's the only way to be Jewish, and there's what do you say? What's the X you would offer a 25-year-old tonight or listening that, hey, I just don't see myself in your map? And a lot of generations do that to other generations. I just don't see myself. I appreciate your faith statement. I appreciate the viability, that you think this viability of the two-state solution. I appreciate that there's an enemy there too. I appreciate the different, but you know what? It ain't my map anymore. What's the X that you would say that keeps the person in not your tent, because it's not our tent anymore? If it's going to be a tent that includes people with whom we disagree a lot, it's not we're not opening the tent so other people can come in. It's other people saying to us, I don't care so much about your tent. That's what sort of my nightmare. I mean, my nightmare is Judaism becoming, I have a little of all of your nightmare, but my nightmare is just looking out and saying, your tent is ridiculous, and your tent is immoral, and your tent is what? Knowing full well that it's exaggerated, etc., I get it. What do you say? What's the X? And you can all answer that. What's the X you would offer a 24-year-old who says, hey man, I no longer see myself in your map. But you know what? The map isn't the territory. The territory is the Jewish people. And the map may be ripped up. And maybe you're still using your map, and I have to construct a map, but the territory is bigger than the map.
Can I answer?
Yeah, please.
I mean, what I would say to that person, who I basically agree with, because I don't believe that the principles of equality under the law and the principles of group supremacy can be reconciled. And I don't believe that what we're seeing in Gaza came out of nowhere. I think Israel's policies, and I say this, and I take no pleasure in saying this, and I know many will not take pleasure in hearing it. Israel's policies from the very beginning, from my view, has been to have as much land as possible with as few Palestinians on it as possible. That's how most of those people in Gaza got to Gaza in the first place. They're not from Gaza. They were expelled from their homes or fled in fear in 1948, and that's 75% of the population in Gaza. And now Israel's cut Gaza in half and essentially made Gaza half as big for a population was already one of the most overcrowded in the world. So I agree with this person who separates their connection to the Jewish people and even to the land, which I also think is deeply rooted in our text, from the idea of a state that was built only in 1948. And to me, to worship any state, as Yeshayahu Leibovitz said again and again, is idolatry. But despite all of that agreement, I think what I would say to this person is, go out and seek out one of your contemporaries whose parents were born in Iran, or seek out one of your contemporaries whose parents were born in the Soviet Union. Because my guess is, or your contemporaries who live in Israel, because my guess is they will not agree with you. Not all young people agree with you. There are very, very, very powerful pockets of young people, obviously the vast, vast majority in Israel, well, not just Israel, in Great Neck, in Deal, in Flatbush, in Beverly Hills. And those kids are your age, and they see things completely different, and they don't doubt for a second the necessity of a Jewish state. And it's because their life experience is different than yours. And it's because their family experiences are more fragile than yours. And so I agree with you, but have the humility to listen to them and hear about the experiences that brought them to that point of view, and take that in. That's what I would say.
I think there are two responses I have to this challenge. I think one is kind of remembering what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said about the idea of being a chosen people, which is that it's not a privilege, it's a responsibility. So I think it's a challenge, it's a demand. I think you could flip that to the question of a Jewish state or homeland for the Jewish people. Is this a challenge that we can step up to? Is there a way that we can find a way to do this in a way that is moral and gives all people equality? But I don't think we can shy away from what we've seen in the last 2 years, and the last 2 years are kind of magnification of a dehumanization of Palestinians that has been kind of growing within Israeli society, and also, I think, kind of affected the way Jews around the world look at Palestinians. And so I think the other question is, if you're not sure if this young person is not sure how to relate to Israel, how do you take that towards your own relationship to the Jewish people? And I think you could try to find a way to bring whatever your moral convictions are to your Jewish community here and to our very broken country that we live in. And so I think there are other ways to expand the tent that would allow the people who feel like maybe they've given up for now on Israel to still remain part of our community. And I think, flipping it back to my beginning, the challenge is on us, those who still believe that Israel is a vital and important and a place that we care and love, to prove that chosenness that we believe in is a responsibility that we can step up to.
Just a word about this mythical tent. I think that Moses learned pretty quickly after leaving Egypt that trying to walk hundreds of thousands of Jews through the desert wasn't always a pleasant situation. So it took about 30 seconds for people to start fighting with each other and with him. And that's, I think somebody mentioned, maybe Elliot, this Talmudic principle of Elu ve'elu, right, that like both these and these are the words of the living God. But also the rabbis of the Talmud had some really kind of amazing insults for each other and creative ones. And at one point, the students of Shammai, these Hillel and Shammai, these rabbis who are so respectful to each other, even though they always disagree. But the students of Shammai at one point actually draw swords and kill the students of Hillel. So it doesn't always go well. And there's, of course, thousands of examples later in Jewish history. So I don't think we've ever had this tent. The question is how we can hopefully not actually kill each other, but be in all of our messy, argumentative selves, and also be committed to the idea of Klal Yisrael, not as the whole of the Jewish people, not as meaning that we all have to get along and just kumbaya, but that we have a responsibility toward the entire Jewish people, including the half of the Jewish people who live in Israel. And I think this is the challenge, well, that we have many challenges as a Jewish community. One is, how do we right-size our American Jewish relationship to Israel? Stop using Israel as the vehicle for our identity, right? Send the kids to Israel so they'll feel more Jewish, and et cetera, et cetera. So how do we create a really live Jewish community and Jewish life here, including art and music and ritual and prayer and everything else, literature, and also not lose that connection to the half of the Jewish people who live in Israel? And so again, this is not I don't want a tent that only people with certain political views are in. I think we can argue about politics, and the argument about politics, that's ultimately a kind of secular argument. But we need to start with this commitment to the half of the Jews who live in Israel, and we can't walk away from them, that we need to have relationships with Israeli Jews and feel like their fate is also part of our fate, just as, I grew up during the Soviet Jewry movement and felt like, even though I hadn't met I hadn't been to the Soviet Union as a kid, but that was also part of my responsibility as a Jew. So what is our responsibility as American Jews toward Israeli Jews and Jews elsewhere in the world, and hopefully vice versa? And I don't think we as American Jews can just say, well, I'm just walking away from Israel, I'm going to have my Jewish life here, I have nothing to do with them, because at the end of the day, first of all, that is our holy place, not the state, as Peter said, but the land, Eretz Yisrael, not Medinat Yisrael. And We have a relationship with Yisrael, half of whom live there, and we can't try to create a Jewish community that has nothing to do with half of the Jews.
So the panel began, I'm going to say two things somewhat in contradiction, that any statement we make about whatever our views are needs to be made credible by way of Palestinian suffering, right? I don't think, and I thank you, Peter, for it, right? We need to have those conversations, we need to have those images, we need to know that pain and suffering. But the corollary to that is any statement we make needs to be credible in the face of an IDF soldier who for the last 2 years has been risking life and limb to make sure the atrocities of October 7th never happen again, that Israel has every right to self-determination and self-defense, and seeking to bring home the return of hostages who were ripped out of their lives on that terrible, dark day. And a soldier, as my nephew, as other soldiers that I've spoken to who are fighting a war against a terrorist Hamas organization, who are using innocent Palestinians as shields in their efforts to fight urban warfare against Israel at that time, which is not to excuse any misdeeds committed by the IDF over these few years of warfare, but to simply have the conversation framed from Palestinian suffering leading to genocide and war crimes is to miss a rather big middle ground that exists in between those two. And so I would urge...
How would you articulate that to the 24-year-old? I got that.
So I would say, if you haven't sat down with an IDF soldier who has been fighting this war, then you are missing a critical conversation that will shape whatever your emergent view is. And I think that's a necessary thing for anyone to have. You got to speak to Palestinians, and you got to speak to that 22-year-old Israeli soldier before you open your mouth.
So
so now,
that's great.
I would also say, and here, Gil, I think I'm in real agreement with you. You know, I think there's a real moment of cheshbon hanefesh that what I call the OJC, the Organized Jewish Community, needs to do. So I think of that proverbial and actual Hillel that has excluded certain voices when it comes, because the student body is about 8 political steps away from the philanthropic heft of that institution, and because they exclude certain voices, those young Jewish voices are not finding institutional life of American Jewish life, be it a Hillel, be it a synagogue, be it otherwise, from a place that they can give an expression of the fullness of their being, which is why I think a conversation like this is so darn important, that we need to make sure that our religious institutions, our JCCs and otherwise, are not creating an ideological straitjacket that excludes a generation seeking to live vital Jewish lives.
I know we all can stay longer. I see very few people have left, and usually people leave by now. So I know, but we do have to wrap. I want to say I am really struck by the answers to this question, because they actually relate to the nightmares in a magnificent way. So I said, what do you say to the 22-year-old? Of course, that's a projection anyhow. And Peter says, listen, you'd expect him to simply agree. Peter says, listen, go speak to people exactly your age who feel exactly the opposite of you, so that you will have a more expanded view. Esther comes and she says, listen, The nightmare is this entire system, this religious system called Judaism, is simply going to become immoral and brutal because of the way in which we use power. So listen, if somebody has moral convictions, find a place to play out your Jewish moral convictions. Maybe for right now it won't be in the state. Maybe it'll be some, but find a place to play out your moral convictions, and that will, maybe you'll make your way back. And that's a magnificent answer in the trust in sort of Judaism, right? Jill comes and says, and it's so perfect, it's, listen, there's this politics stuff, and then there's this Judaism stuff, and work harder. Get engaged, right? Just play the game. Play the game. Argue more. Argue more. The game's not over just because, sort of we're behind the 8 ball right now. Bring it all forward. And then Elliot does something perfect. He actually, I don't mean plays, choreographs both sides, not plays. Choreographs both sides. To one side, he says, to the kid, says, listen, okay, this is more serious, right? And it's hard, and I get it, but you want to know something? Go speak to an IDF soldier. Go speak to someone who has a whole different take and who's made a sacrifice, because it's easy to bullshit around. Go talk to someone who makes a sacrifice, which, by the way, may be a problem with liberal Zionists in general in terms of our understanding of sacrifice. So go talk to someone who actually really, your nephew, but go talk to someone who really makes a sacrifice every day and is not some immoral person. And then says to the turns, and we're talking about an institutional leader in a pretty significant central institution, okay? It's not a radical institution, right or left, Park Avenue Synagogue. And he turns to the institutions and says, and you better get your act together, us institutions. Because if there's no place, for this person who I just told you better go speak to an IDF soldier. If there's no place, and by the way, you should read, there's an article there's something either you spoke about, you talk about sitting next to your kid, your daughter, in an APAC conference, very, very moving. I'm sure you can Google it and find it. That we better get our act together. That's the model if we are going to wander together. That is one of the big metaphors, right? One of the large metaphors in our system is wandering. And so I'm going to close with this. You have an image, we wander, and sometimes you wander out of necessity, and sometimes you wander out of a seeking, of the truth. And I don't expect anybody to leave this room with a solution. We're the last people who should be into final solutions. And I mean it. I mean it. What if actually there is no immediate solution for the foreseeable future? If there's no immediate solution, then American Jews should take these 4 people very, very seriously. They should take an Elliot very seriously. Those of us who are institutionalists, we better get our act together. Those of us who talk to young people, we better get our act together and think very much along the lines. We better think like Jill. If we really do think the 2-state solution is still viable, right? If we really do, we better work hard. We better work hard. And if we really do believe that Judaism is fundamentally a tradition in the pursuit of equality and justice, and that it is anti-occupation, and Judaism cannot become one more brutal religion. If we really do think that, then anywhere we play out the moral inclinations and the moral sensibilities, and if we really, there's not going to be a solution in the near term, then it may be that disagreeing with Peter about the outcome, because the chances of seeing a 1-state, 2-state, 1-state all Jewish, 1-state not Jewish, confederation, Beinart, the chances of seeing any one of those solutions in the near term is probably not high. Which means the critique needs to be separated from the discussion or the argument about the outcome. The outcome we'll see, but it may be the critique is a very significant critique for those of us who are not happy about the way in which American Judaism, relative to Israel, American institutions, the way in which we're operating. If we can open up that much, and we can tolerate the discomfort that we were able to tolerate today, and we can do that with each other, we have a chance to wander together a little more successfully. And that's my hope and my prayer, and I thank all of you very, very much.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for this difficult, vulnerable, emotional, complicated conversation, and for being willing to be part of this. It's not a given. It's not a given. Thank you, Irwin, for guiding the conversation to places that are not obvious. This was not the typical conversation one hears. And so I'm really, we are very grateful for you being here, for everybody being here, being open and willing. And so just a couple of things that are coming up for BJ members. Raise your hand if you're a BJ member. You're invited to participate in a follow-up community conversation on Monday, January 12th, which is next week, between 6 to 8, in person here. Or on Zoom, and there are many BJ members who are on Zoom as well tonight, on January 13th, which is Tuesday, between 7 and 8:30, that will be on Zoom. If you are interested in either of these conversations, community conversations, to follow up on what happened today and to model as a community dialogue and listening to each other openly and generously, please go to the BJ website and register. There's going to be a follow-up email. In that follow-up email, you'll find the possibility to register if you're a BJ member. You'll also find the link to the recording of the conversation tonight if you want to review it. The conversation will be available as well after tomorrow in the YouTube channel of BJ. You can find it there, along with many other BJ recordings and videos, including the previous presentations of this series at a Crossroads. Finally, if you want to find any information about BJ, go to bj.org. And there's a lot there and a lot coming. And thank you for being here tonight. The next presentation of this series will be with Tel Aviv Review of Books, a date to be March 12th.